So I'm going to walk you through some of the main parts of our Arduino board just so you start to get a little bit more familiar with it. So this part right here is our USB connector. So this is how, if you had a physical board, you would connect it to your computer to get your code to run the board. It also can pull power through this port. Underneath of that is the power port. So if you didn't want your board or your project to be tied to a computer, you could power it through an AC to DC adapter or a battery using this port right here on your board. Next, this long black piece, this is our microcontroller. It's basically like the brains of your Arduino. And it has lots of different things that are part of it. So there is flash memory, RAM, CPU, things like that are all part of this microcontroller. Oops. Underneath of that, we have our analog in pins, and they're labeled from A0 to A5. So these 6 pins can read the signal from an analog sensor like a temperature sensor and convert it into a digital value so that the system understands it. These pins just measure voltage and not the current because they have very little or a very high internal resistance. And these pins are labeled analog, and they're analog by default, but they could be used and programmed for digital input or output also. So they are programmable in your code. Next to that, we have our power pins. So we have 2 ground pins. So if you need to ground your circuit, we have those. You can also use this 5 volt and 3.3 volt as parts to power other things. So those are our power ports. And then up at the top, we have our digital pins. So these are labeled digital 0 to 13. And these can either be input or output, and you just basically in your code tell it if you want to be input or output. When they are output, they can act as power supply for different things connected to them. And when they're used as input, they can read signals from things that are connected to them. So like you could have a sensor connected to it as input, or an LED if you want it to be powered by electricity to light up the LED. When digital pins are used as output, they supply 40 milliamps of current at 5 volts, which is more than enough to light an LED. So there's plenty of power going through there. Some of these have this little tilde or wavy signal next to the pin numbers, and these act as a normal digital pin, but can also be used for what is called pulse width modulation, or PWM, which simulates analog output. Like if you wanted to have an LED fade in and out, those pins would allow you to do that. We do have a reset switch, and basically when it's clicked, it sends a pulse through the whole microcontroller, and it tells it to run the program again from the start. It can be useful if your code doesn't repeat, but you want to test it a lot of times. There are other things in here like a crystal oscillator, which it ticks 16 million times a second, and basically for each tick, it does a line of code or an operation, or your microcontroller does that. So that's basically how fast it runs, and it's very quick, so 16 million times a second. And then we also have these TX and RX. These are LEDs, so they would light up. So TX stands for transmit, RX stands for receive. So these blink whenever the Uno board is transmitting or receiving data. So on your like if you had a physical board, it would blink as it gets the code from your computer and things like that, or if it's sending code back to it. So those are kind of the main parts and quick overview of our Arduino Uno board.